Harare is mostly calm, but you can't film the soldiers openly.
By the way, I'm tilting my phone because I'm a bit scared to point cameras at soldiers.
The streets relatively normal, yet the country's first and only president in 37 years of independence and his family rounded up under house arrest. In 3 words, a military coup. This morning, the South African president confirmed that house arrest.
I have also contacted His Excellency President Mugabe, whom I had time to talk to, and he is fine, but confined in his home.
Gunfire around Harare overnight. This damage caused as soldiers fought with security guards to arrest the man who oversaw Zimbabwe's financial collapse, Finance Minister Ignatius Chombo, who lived in some splendour. Overnight, the military commandeered the state broadcaster, telling the nation that what looked like a coup wasn't a coup.
We wish to make it abundantly clear that this is not a military takeover of government. What the Zimbabwe Defense Forces is doing is to pacify a degenerating political, social, and economic situation in our country, which, if not addressed, may result in a violent conflict.
In plain English, the military want her out, and they want her out now. So this is as much coup de grace, or rather coup de grace, as coup d'etat. Grace Mugabe, to be precise. She has systematically removed all opposition to her taking over the mantle from her husband, who at 93 is increasingly incapable of running the country.
Saka, his word will be final. Mark my words, his word will be final.
As Robert Mugabe's wife lay dying with cancer, his affair with his secretary Grace produced 2 children. And from then on, Grace seemed unstoppable and opposition intolerant, personally and politically. In August, on holiday, she was accused of attacking the South African model Gabriella Engels with an electric plug, leaving Miss Engels with lacerations and bruising. Mugabe says it was self-defense. At home, as Zimbabweans queue round the block to get bundles of cash from the bank to buy bread, Grace Mugabe's sons pour champagne over their $10,000 wristwatch in a nightclub and post it on social media. Then, to cap it all, Grace Mugabe is believed to have persuaded her husband to sack Vice President Emmerson Mnangagwa last week. The military went into strategizing the coup. With Grace Mugabe reportedly out of the country, they made their move, and opposition leaders can scarcely believe it.
Situation in Zimbabwe and the position where the country had been taken to by President Robert Mugabe and his wife was untenable. We have got a huge, massive economic crisis. The big question now is, how do we turn back to legitimacy? How do we restore constitutional order? That is the only big question.
I think it's also a sign of relief to Zimbabweans because from the look of things, Zimbabweans are happy that at least there's been a stop to the family dynasty agenda that was being propagated by Robert Mugabe and his wife.
So much for the woman the military wants out, but what of the man they want in? Emmerson Mnangagwa, or the Crocodile. A man with a reputation for not taking prisoners, a career forged in the war to end white minority rule in Rhodesia. At one point, he was sentenced to death. After independence in 1980, the Crocodile became something of a chief enforcer for Mugabe, not least in brutally suppressing opposition in Matabeleland, where it said he orchestrated the mass murder of tens of thousands of opposition supporters. Mnangagwa and Mugabe both put under EU sanctions some years later as they forcibly evicted white farmers from across the country.
I, Emmerson Mnangagwa, swear that I will be faithful to Zimbabwe.
2014, Emmerson Mnangagwa sworn in as vice president, Robert Mugabe's right-hand man at last, and the pathway to the top now mapped out. Except Grace was ahead of him, waiting to get him the sack. So what next? Well, listen to the general.
Comrade R.G. Mugabe and his family are safe and sound, and their security is guaranteed.
So why is Mugabe's safety so important? Because after a generation as leader, they'll probably make an offer to the old man that he can't refuse. Mr. President, the great years are over. You must now hand power to Mr. Mnangagwa. So Zimbabweans watch and wait. The Mugabe years ultimately ended because he turned white minority rule into black minority rule. Him, the wife, and the inner elite. But will the coming of the crocodile really, finally, bring democracy here? People are relieved, but they're not exactly dancing in the streets.
Alex Thompson reporting. Well, joining us now from Harare is the former Zimbabwean MP, Bright Matonga. He served in Mugabe's government, and with me here is the human rights activist Mary Ndoro, who supports the main opposition party, and the Zimbabwean lawyer Lloyd Masipa, who is director of the Africa Public Policy Research Institute, which provides advice on good governance. My goodness, they'll need that in Zimbabwe. Let us start with you, Bright Matonga. How are things on the streets of Harare tonight?
It's very calm. Things are going back to normal. I was able to drive early this morning to drive around Harare. Obviously, there was still some army vehicles, but it was calm. But by the afternoon, they'd moved back to the barracks. So I would say things are getting back to normal. But obviously, people are a bit unsure of what is happening. But we've been assured by the army that people are not going to be harassed and things are under control.
Do you think Mr. Mnangagwa is the man to run the country now? And is he back in the country, do you know?
I wouldn't go that far. I think what has happened is unbelievable. It's like Christmas that has come early. We never thought this was going to happen. So we're still digesting. We're still trying to figure out what is going to happen. But I can safely say that majority of Zimbabweans, if not all, we are so relieved by this development. And we are very positive for the future of Zimbabwe because things have been going down in a spiral way.
We know where Mr. Mugabe is. He's in his own house under house arrest. But Grace, do we have any idea where she is?
No, the first family is in Zimbabwe. They are safe. I think they are we're told they are resting. But yeah, she is in Zimbabwe.
She is with him?
She is in Zimbabwe. They are safe. But the army, they are obviously looking for those people that were misleading the president. I think you've heard about arrests, about certain ministers. That process is still going on. Nothing has been announced as yet on television. But what I can safely say is that the president and the first lady, they are in Zimbabwe. They are at the brew of their house.
Let me pause you there, because I want just to bring in our guests in the studio. Well, Mary Ndoro, you were so thrilled you were dancing outside the embassy today.
Yes, I was today, this afternoon. We are actually grateful of what is happening. At least we can see there's going to be a change. And for 37 years, people have been waiting for this moment, for Zimbabwe to be free.
The question is whether this is the moment, because, of course, a lot of pretty bad people are still knocking around, likely to want to put their hands on power.
Yes, it's not very clear, but it's opening everyone's eyes to see what is happening in Zimbabwe, as well for other international countries to help us to remove Mugabe regime and the ZANU-PF.
But now, Lloyd Masipa, this is a very embedded regime. I mean, you can knock off the top, but there's still a lot of the pillars still in position. And although some ministers, according to Bright, have been arrested, it's a big job to turn this into a democracy.
The democratization process has begun, essentially. The danger of what is happening is that the democracy in the party, because remember, what is happening here is a realignment process happening in ZANU-PF. It is not about governance. It's not about Mugabe as the president of Zimbabwe. It's about Mugabe as the first secretary of ZANU-PF.
they are challenging him in his capacity as the head of ZANU-PF to fix things in the party.
Well, do you think democracy is realizable in the party? It doesn't have a tradition of it, does it?
No, it has a tradition.
Long ago?
No, remember, ZANU-PF is a party born of the liberation struggle. So what is happening now is the natural turn of events where transition is happening. We've seen it that with first-generation leaders in Africa, they tend to overstay because there's that godly thing that we tend to, we hold them in awe for so long. But you find after Mugabe, the wheels will start turning and there'll be, consistent change of leaders.
Do you see any chance that your party would have any chance of some kind of foothold on power?
Yes, the chances are there because there are so many supporters in Zimbabwe and around the world who are supporting, and as well for Mugabe to go so that Zimbabwe can have a change and come back to normal.
Well, let me just ask you, Bright, the question surely is whether this chap, Mr. Mnangagwa, is capable of delivering any sort of democracy. I mean, he has a bad record.
Look, all of us, we've been a victim of this process. Remember, I was a deputy minister, I was a government spokesperson. We questioned, we wanted changes within government, within ZANU-PF. Then we found ourselves locked out, without jobs. We were kicked out. The same applies to Joyce Mujuru, now Mnangagwa, and a lot of other ministers and honorable members. We are trying to make changes within ZANU-PF. This is not about Mnangagwa. This is not about an individual. But, we had a lot of faith in our president, but he let us down. And that's why we decided, as Zimbabweans combined, to come together and force this process. So this process was a result of ZANU-PF or former ZANU-PF members and those within, with the help of, obviously, with our army, because we were born out of the liberation struggle.
Well, look,
we came together to initiate this process.
Let me put something to each of you. Are you remotely optimistic tonight that this will eventually result, say, within a matter of a year, in democracy?
Definitely. Definitely.
Yes, definitely.
Both of you are nodding.
Yeah, definitely.
And you, Bright?
We're very positive. We want to see a new Zimbabwe that involves everyone without the color, tribe, or so. Really, we're hoping that the army will facilitate that process. We hope that people won't overstay. People won't, want that process of overstaying in power.
Right. Bright Matonga, Merindoro, and Lloyd Masipa. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Thank you.
I, Robert Gabriel Mugabe.
Once revered as the liberator of Zimbabwe, Robert Mugabe became an international pariah, blamed for beggaring the nation he'd fathered. His is the story of a man who destroyed everything he'd created. He became the leader of guerrillas fighting white minority rule in Rhodesia in the 1970s. The conflict shaped him, and in his mind never really ended.
The armed struggle will continue until a settlement of our own liking emerges.
Peace came with the signing of the Lancaster House Agreement in London. But Mugabe never trusted his hosts. In the 60s, the colonial power had jailed him for a decade for opposing white rule. He'd not been allowed to attend his 3-year-old son's funeral, and he never forgave the British. In 1980, Britain finally let go. Rhodesia became Zimbabwe, and the Union flag was lowered for the last time. Bob Marley sang freedom songs, and Bob Mugabe's first speech as Prime Minister was a model of reconciliation.
Yesterday, I fought you as an enemy. Today, you have become a friend and ally, with the same national interest, loyalty, rights and duties as myself. If yesterday you hated me, today you cannot avoid the love that binds you to me and me to you.
But he had no love for his internal enemies, firing fellow freedom fighter Joshua Nkomo from his cabinet and unleashing the notorious 5th Brigade in Nkomo's home area of Matabeleland. 20,000 civilians were killed. But the world turned a blind eye because leaders feared stirring up more trouble in Zimbabwe. Mugabe's wife Sally was a huge influence on him, but many say when she died and he married his secretary Grace, he lost any moral compass he might once have had. The second Mrs. Mugabe became known not as the First Lady, but the first shopper. Zimbabwe's commercial farms, the secret to the country's success, was still largely in white hands. When white farmers started to fund a new opposition party, he got people he called veterans of the Liberation War to evict them by whatever means. Britain, Zimbabwe's main aid donor, had no right to criticise, he said.
What have the British to do with Zimbabwe? Who are you? You bloody idiots!
In the 2002 elections, voters in the capital stormed the polling stations. His policies had made them poorer and they wanted him out. But polling agents were beaten up and rural voters stuck with Mugabe. In subsequent elections, thousands of opposition supporters were beaten and tortured. At rallies, he railed against the then British Prime Minister Tony Blair and against gay men. Lower than dogs and pigs, he said. Economic decline was matched by wanton destruction. In 2005, Mugabe ordered many urban houses bulldozed because the owners supported his opponents.
To the deepening of cooperation between Zimbabwe and China.
After the West imposed sanctions, he courted China. We have turned to the east where the sun rises and given our back to the West, he said. But he always arrived at the state opening of Parliament in Harare in a vintage Rolls-Royce, insisting on neo-colonial pomp and circumstance.
Happy birthday to you.
Grace Mugabe seemed happy on her husband's 93rd birthday this year. As he visibly declined, her ambition grew. But it was too much for the old guard when she made him sack his long-term vice president, Emmerson Mnangagwa, last week. Throughout his long life, Robert Mugabe has nurtured his own power more carefully than the welfare of his country. But he remains a hero of anti-colonialism for many in Africa. Earlier this week, they named Harare International Airport after him, as if he were already dead. But he will, it seems, live out his last days at home. A mighty power fallen, victim of the woman he loved and the soldiers and party he thought would always be loyal. An old man, fading into history.
Lindsay Hilson reporting. Well, earlier this evening I spoke to the Africa Minister, Rory Stewart, and I put it to him that although nobody likes a coup, this one had certainly delivered a plus.
I think the real plus here is if this means, John, that we have an opportunity to actually move to a credible election next year. As you know, Robert Mugabe was still proposing to stand in 2018, and the past elections have basically been stolen. So if this means we're moving to an opportunity where we can actually have a fair election and ZANU-PF runs fairly, Zimbabwe has extraordinary potential. And this could be, but we're very cautious at the moment because this is happening very fast and we're just the beginning. But this could be something we could be cautiously positive about.
But two words that have not yet emanated from whatever's going on in Harare are election and fair. Neither of those appear to have been on the rise. And Mr. Mnangagwa is said to have been in touch with Britain. Do you have any awareness of this?
No, hasn't been in touch with us. Hasn't been in touch at all. Not at all to my awareness.
And what's our feeling about him? Because obviously, historically, he was bound up with the massacres in Matabeleland. I'm not quite sure how we view him.
Well, I guess the fundamental thing which you'd expect me to say is that we'd expect the elections which are constitutional. I mean, these are elections that have to happen before August next year in line with the Zimbabwean constitution to allow the Zimbabwean people to choose. But you're right, there's a lot of reasons to be concerned about Mr. Mnangagwa, and indeed for many, many of the other people in ZANU-PF, and indeed some people who aren't in ZANU-PF anymore. So it's a very, very disturbing system. This was a kleptocratic system. It was heavily militarized. Many of these people have been involved in human rights abuses and atrocities, which is why we hope that an election could provide an opportunity for Zimbabwe to turn over a better and cleaner page.
You're a minister who's had experience of the development budget, of using development. I mean, it's quite clear that whoever does take over is going to be desperate for assistance. Can you see a quid pro quo whereby it might be possible for Britain to offer quite considerable aid in return for the words fair and free and election?
John, yes, if it's more than words. I mean, if we really can move to a serious free, fair election, of course Britain would invest strongly in that, and not just Britain, I think the entire international community. There's a big role here for the African Union and SADC, the Southern African states. There should be a role here for the UN. And Britain, we already have quite a large DFID budget in Zimbabwe focused on supporting the Zimbabwean people. But we and others, the IMF and the World Bank, could come in and produce something really positive for Zimbabwe. And we want to make sure that as we talk about elections next year, we have a really positive vision about what that could mean for the legitimacy of the new government, but also for the economic future of the people.
The awful truth is that there have been terrible violations of human rights. There are lots of scores that people want to see settled. It's going to be very, very difficult to do much with any hangovers from the Mugabe regime, and yet it's almost inevitable that some elements of them will be there.
So you're absolutely right that ZANU-PF, Mugabe's party, is very, very strongly established. But I think things may be changing. It's very, very early days. Things may be changing. This may be the beginning of an opening up, which is what we're hoping.
Minister, thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you very much, John.